This is a very special day for me. I spent most of my life listening to and learning from Ralph Abele. I met Ralph when I was just 14 years old, and he showed up to actually teach us how to identify trees and shrubs and wild plants. And it was an interesting moment because we were expecting Roger Latham, but Roger Latham was called away for another matter, and so Ralph showed up, and we didn't know who this guy was. And he looked at me, and the first thing he did was chew me out because I was wearing sneakers to go on a hike into the woods, and he told me quite in a military way that I was off base with my shoes, and I needed to get myself together. And that started an incredible friendship that we had. You know, Ralph was my scout leader, and he was many other young men's scout leader. And he was a great, great scout leader. You know, he won the Silver Beaver Award. He just absolutely loved what the Scouts stood for. Later was instrumental in bringing the Scouts to their Eastern Jamboree at Moraine State Park, a very important moment in Ralph's life. But before he was my Scout leader, Ralph was a great military leader, and if you look at his military record, it's second to none. And Ralph used to often give Winston Churchill speeches in Winston Churchill ways, and it was quite remarkable, telling us a story of what was taking place during the war, and then giving the wartime speeches of Winston Churchill. It was very moving, and I still hear those speeches today. When I applied for the Joint House Senate Conservation Committee, and Senator Curry, it's so great to see you. What a great leader you've been, and it's great to see you once again. But when I applied for the position of the Joint Conservation Committee, Pete Duncan was interviewing me, and he went through a whole process, and I met with a number of the members of the committee, and Pete finally said, well, there's one other person I'd like you to meet. And he said that before I make a decision, so would you jump in my car? So we drove out to Walnut Street, and all of a sudden I realized we were headed to the Fish Commission to see Ralph Abele. And so I didn't get a chance to explain to Pete that Ralph was my Scout leader. So we walk into Ralph's office, and Senator Curry was right about his mischievous humor. He looked at me, and Pete said, Ralph, I want to introduce you to Larry Schweiger. He's a finalist for this position. And Ralph just looked at Pete and said, Pete, surely you could do better than that. And poor Pete blanched, his whole face went white, and he was so embarrassed for what Ralph had just done. And of course, I was sitting there laughing because I had known how Ralph's great humor was. After I got hired by the committee, by Pete and the others, the committee, Ralph took me out to lunch, and we went down to the Locust Street Cafe. You may remember that on 2nd Street, and he took me down to lunch, and he said, Larry, I want you to know something. He said, there are 2 times when you can really have an impact in government. He said, the first time is when you're young and you don't give a shit. He said, the second time is when you're old and you don't give a shit. He said, you're in that first category and I'm in the second category, so let's go have fun. And that was Ralph. There was a moment in my life when I really needed some support, and Ralph and his dear wife Peggy invited me to their house for dinner and spend the weekend with them. And we were talking about my life circumstance, and he was really coaching me and helping me to sort through some things. And while we were sitting there in his living room talking, the telephone rang, and he picked up the phone, and it was George Bloom, George was the chairman of the Republican Committee and chairman of the State Utility Commission. And Bloom had this real booming voice, and I could hear him from across the room. He goes, hi, Ralph, how are you doing? This is George. And Ralph goes, hi, George, how are you this evening? And George says, not so good, Ralph. And Ralph said, what's the matter? He said, well, a couple of your waterways patrolmen arrested one of my good friends. And Ralph paused for a moment. He said, George, you need to pick your friends more carefully. And that was the end of that conversation. And that's the way Ralph was. And his field force understood that, because Ralph said it was resources first, and he believed that, and he inculcated that notion into the great team. He used to call them the thin green line. And that's a great tradition to this day. Ralph also was a great leader on acid rain, and we worked the halls of Congress, working particularly close with the late Senator John Hines, who dearly loved Ralph because Ralph was a great person and a great military leader, and Hines just loved everything about Ralph. And so anyway, we convinced Senator Hines that he needed to be the sponsor on the acid rain control bill. And after much work in the state, we got the momentum going to get this done. And so Senator Hines and Senator Tim Wirth from Colorado wrote the acid rain control bill of 1990. And we got it passed, and it was the first cap and trade pollution control bill in the history of the planet. And Senator Tim Wirth went on beyond that and wrote it into the Kyoto Agreement, the same basic principle that we put into the original acid rain program, put in for carbon dioxide. So that notion that Ralph believed so strongly in it, doing it right and doing it in a reasonable way, continues to this day. I find it really interesting that the Canadians honored all the folks who were instrumental in passing the acid rain control bill, which incidentally just recently led to the elimination of mercury from power plants. We finally got the rules enacted. After 1990, we finally got the rules passed, and the industry wants more time to consider, give me a break. But anyway, we were able to do that, and it's a great example of Ralph's leadership and his tenacity. But the Canadians, when they put together the list of people that they wanted to honor, Ralph's name is on that list first. It's because his name's starting with A, but it was also about his willingness to make it happen. And I've talked often to the leaders of that movement, and they believed very strongly that Ralph was critical to that effort. During the years of James Watt as Secretary of Interior, Ralph had a lot of problems with Secretary Watt, as you can imagine, and so did I and others. And so we wrote a letter to Senator Hines asking that Senator Hines urge the president to fire James Watt because he was doing all these bad things. And so Senator Hines called us up and he said, "Have you ever actually met with this guy?" And we said, "No, we haven't." So he said, "Let me set something up." So we went down to have breakfast with Secretary Watt in the Secretary of Interior's office, and the meeting started off, and Senator Hines introduced everybody around the room, and started with Doc Goddard. We spoke and raised a number of his concerns about what the Secretary was doing wrong, and then he got to Ralph Abele, and Ralph really laid into him on a number of things on the surface mining program, and on it goes. And Watt sat there for a minute, and he finally said, "You're nothing but a bunch of liberal pinko communists." Can you imagine that? And I looked over at Senator Hines, and his face got beet red. He stood up, and he looked at Secretary Watt, and he said, "This meeting is over." And he walked out of the building with us. We didn't even have breakfast yet. We just were drinking coffee. And we walked out of the Secretary of Interior's office, and he got out on the street, and he said, "I'm going to communicate to Ronald Reagan that this man needs to go." And in fact, he did. The thing about Ralph that a lot of people don't know is that Ralph was actually mentored as a boy by John M. Phillips, and some of you may know that name. But John Phillips founded the Pennsylvania Game Commission. He was instrumental in the acquisition of the first game lands. He wrote the game code. He was an incredible conservationist of a generation before Ralph. And so Ralph was really inculcated with that. But John Phillips actually was taught by a Native American Indian chief from the Chippewa tribe, actually, whose name was Chief Big Storm. And so Ralph had this multi-generational dimension to him because he understood the tradition of John Phillips, the tradition of Big Storm. And he understood that we have a duty to take care of nature and that we needed to love nature, and Ralph did so deeply. And in thinking about that, one of the things that we used to tease Ralph about a lot was his stubbornness. When Ralph made his mind up, you couldn't change it. It was pretty straightforward. It didn't matter who was against him. It didn't matter what issue it might be, including rattlesnakes. I mean, Ralph would go to the mat for a rattlesnake. I see this snake out here, and it's a cute story that's with that. But Ralph believed very strongly that stubbornness was not a vice, but a virtue. And he used to tell me that. He said, you know, it's not a vice, it's a virtue. You just need to be careful about the things that you're stubborn, because you just might make those happen. And that sticks with me. And to this day, when I'm facing a tough decision, whether it's on climate change, and incidentally, I know for certain where Ralph would be on climate change. There's no doubt in my mind what he'd be doing today. And so when I work on issues like that, I remember what Ralph would say, and I hear his voice. I hear his gravelly voice today. And it means a lot to me. The snake that we see in front of us is another sweet story, and I'll close with that because it really sums up who Ralph was. Ralph used to wear a tie when he met with the governor once a year. The governor had this required meeting with the commission heads, and Ralph used to wear this "Don't Tread on Me" tie. And Dick Thornburg, 7 years in a row, saw the same tie, and he used to say, "Ralph, don't you have another tie to wear?" And so the final year that Thornburg was in office, Ralph showed up and he had a tartan tie on. And the governor saw this tie. He said, "Ralph, I'm sure glad your wife got you a new tie." And Ralph said, "Well, Governor, this is tartan, and the meaning behind this is don't tread on me." So it's with great fondness that I reflect on this man who had a profound influence on not just me, but on thousands of Scouts and others through his many years of service. And certainly the impact on this agency has been tremendous. Ralph was so proud of the Fish Commission, so proud of the courageous waterways patrolmen and all the other staff that worked so hard to make this place a special place. And I worry deeply what I'm seeing on the Susquehanna River and on the Juniata declines of these fisheries. It just breaks my heart. And I know damn well that Ralph Wobble would be fighting hard to stop climate change, because it's warm water and it's also pollution. And those are the things that Ralph knew were absolutely critical for fisheries. So working together, we can carry on that great tradition that Ralph has started. And I'm so glad to see all the folks who are in this room today willing to come out to celebrate a great human being. Thank you.